Let's go ahead and get started. How's everybody doing? Good. So some housekeeping stuff. Those of you in 4931 or 6921, the proposals were supposedly due on the 1st. I realized last night, because someone kindly sent me an email, that you had no place to turn those in on Canvas, because I had never turned on that Canvas class, and so now that's on. You should have a place to do that, but because of my blunder, I'm giving you a few more days there to turn that in. So that's just for the people that are doing projects to turn in their project proposals. And if you've got concerns about the projects or anything, just come see me or send me an email and we can work together on that. Any questions on that? Okay. And then for the folks in WATS 6915, raise your hands if you're still here. One of you is still here. 3 of you are still here. Okay. So your last official day is Thursday, so we're all going to be sad to see you go, and you're going to, I'm sure, be sad not to have to come to class anymore. You're welcome to keep coming. If there's any particular topics that are of interest to you, you're welcome to come to labs and get help as well. But as far as what you're required to do for the course, Thursday will be it, and Lab 4 will be all that you have to turn in. One other little side note. How many of you have found this effects toolbar? Or have any idea what I'm talking about here? Not a single person? So how do you load a toolbar in ArcGIS? This is just complete tangent here. Yeah, right-click on an empty space of the toolbar, and you get that context drop-down, and then it has all those different toolbars that you can load up. There's one you'll find is called Effects. And with the Effects toolbar, the reason I'm mentioning this now is because in Lab 3, you're starting to play with a lot more layers. And then Lab 4, this week, you'll play with a lot more layers as well. And sometimes being able to turn on and off layers is one way of seeing what's underneath things and playing with this. But this Effects toolbar has this handy little button, which if you click it, allows you to drag a layer dynamically on and off. And so it's kind of like literally lifting up the page and seeing what's underneath that layer. So in the toolbar, you put the layer that you want to see and drag on and off, and then the layers underneath it will become visible. There's some other little games you can play with that, but you might find that sort of handy if for nothing else to waste time. Okay, the reading for today was a very quick skim of chapters 6 and 7, and then a bunch of help links in ArcGIS. And the things that we want to cover today are editing in ArcGIS, and we want to talk about the different workflows we use there. We want to talk about, remind ourselves about attributes when we're dealing with vector data in particular, and then talk about metadata. Okay? So when I say edit, what does that mean to you? Not in terms of GIS, just if I ask you to edit something, what comes to mind? Check it for accuracy. What else? What's that? Effectiveness. Check it for effectiveness. Structure. What's that? Make revisions. Make edits to it. Yep. So we've got checking for various things. We've got actually editing something. Everybody implying that something exists. What else? Correcting errors, right? So we've got something that is an existing layer, and we're going to edit it. And our existing data set that we're going to try and edit. So ArcGIS is it's a little weird. Why do you think they call it the editing in ArcGIS? Because editing is also what in GIS? Creating, drawing, making points, polylines, polygons. So why do they call it editing?
You're actually changing the layer file.
That's right. So you are changing the file, and the file has to exist. Because what's the first step when you start to draw in ArcGIS? So what has to come before that? Create an empty shapefile or an empty feature class. Then you edit it. That's the workflow in Arc. That's why they call it editing. So editing can only apply to existing data sets. And so if you want to draw in Arc, you can't just start, actually that's a lie. You can start drawing, but it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. There is a draw toolbar as well. That's another story. But editing to make actual GIS data, the layer has to exist, even though nothing is on it. Okay? So you guys already came up with most of these reasons for why we would edit existing data to look at errors and inconsistencies in that data. Those could be both positional things like undershoots, overshoots, or they could be things like there's attribute errors, so a label associated with, we looked at fire hydrants on the first day, I think. A label associated with a fire hydrant could be incorrect. Let's see. When we're talking about editing in GIS, you can go back and forth between CAD and GIS. CAD is a lot easier place to do what GIS would call editing, or just to draw and create things. But why do we call it draw in CAD? We touched on this in the very beginning when we were talking about distinctions between computer-assisted drafting, things like AutoCAD and GIS. Where do the entities that you create reside in a CAD drawing?
It's just in like a Cartesian space versus...
That's correct. That's spatially where they exist. Where does the data actually...
In the drawing.
Yeah, exactly. In the CAD document, in the drawing file. And so it's part of the drawing file. The more you draw, the bigger that drawing file gets. Map documents are nothing more than a reference to data that lives somewhere else, and then you telling it how you want to display that. Okay. So there's two primary ways to start editing in ArcGIS. One is you go to the editor toolbar. Again, another right click in the blank toolbar space, and you can bring up this editor toolbar. And then there is a little button at the very top that says start editing. And so when you start editing, another dialog comes up, and what does it have in there? It has a list of all of the layers that are editable, so basically the vector layers in that map document. So the other option is to what? You go into the, right click on a layer in the table of contents. Yep. So you go into the table of contents, you choose the layer that you want to work with, you right click, you scroll down to edit features, and you hit start editing. And so that takes you right in. So when you begin editing, what happens to the editor toolbar? It's already, so it's already there, and you said it becomes active. More specifically, commands and buttons on it become active, because then you can start to use those editing commands. The rest of the time, before you've started editing, they're grayed out, as is sort of shown there. And so a couple of other sort of nuances. So we have to start editing, right? And then there, in the editor toolbar, there's the save edits, and then we've got stop editing. So one of the really annoying things about ArcGIS is when you're drawing, if you like what you're doing, you better save it frequently, because there is no autosave. And one of the good things is that the data is disconnected from that map document. Map documents, as a bunch of you are finding, go haywire now and then, and they get corrupted. Things don't work. And so it's okay, your data is probably still okay. And if you're going through and you're editing and you're saving as you're going, and then you crash in the middle of that, it's okay. Your map document may be screwed, but the data is okay. If you haven't hit save, you could be in trouble. So save frequently, unless you're, just ask yourself, how often am I willing to redraw something? Am I willing to, if I spent 10 minutes drawing something and I lose 10 minutes, is that okay? If the answer is no, then you better make it 5 or 2 minutes in between saves. All right?
So that's where you have to hit save on that toolbar, not like on the.
Yep. So big point of confusion with people, and I'll say this, and then in lab this week, it'll happen over and over again. Someone will say, well, I kept saving my map document. Why? And then it crashed. And then all my edits are not there because you weren't saving the actual edited layer, which is only accessed through that very inconvenient button in the toolbar.
When you save your edits, it's actually modifying the shapefile, right?
Right. Before you've saved it, it actually hasn't made any modifications to the shapefile. They're just in memory.
Within the map document.
It's in memory.
Oh.
It's not actually within the map document either.
Oh, it's just under there.
Mm-hmm. So keep that in mind. And then at the end, when you're done, you need to hit stop editing, and then it'll ask you if you want to save, if there have been changes. And you go ahead and save, and then by stopping editing something, why would I need to stop editing? I'm done. So I can switch to other editing tasks, for example, or there's a lot of things that I can't do with layers, either in Arc Catalog or in Arc Map, when I'm in an edit session. And then there's other things that I can only do in an edit session. So having some consciousness of whether or not you're in an edit session is really important in ArcGIS. I mean, if we were going to talk about just editing in GIS in general, I mean, we could be done in 2 minutes, right? But Arc makes it complicated enough that we're going to spend another 15 or 20 talking about all these nuances. So some other things about the editor toolbar that you should be aware. We've already mentioned that it's only active when you've started editing a layer. How many of you have ArcGIS 9 experience? If there's a few of you. So in 9, it was a little different in that the layer that you were editing actually showed up in the toolbar, right? And in 10, that has gone away. The other thing is that in 10, everything relies on what are called feature templates. Does anybody have any idea what I'm talking about with a feature template? What that is? No? Okay. What feature templates do is they encourage you to think about symbology, attributing, and drawing in just one step, as opposed to just focusing on drawing where the points are or where the polylines or the polygons are. What these feature templates encourage you to do is take all of that into account. And so you'll notice when you start an edit session, this annoying little create features box comes up. And sometimes when that comes up, the layer that you said you wanted to edit doesn't show up there. What's going on for those of you that have a little bit of editing experience? What's going on? Why doesn't it show up as something in that feature template?
Template's not loaded.
Yeah, it says a template's not loaded. So I can't explain exactly why, but sometimes when you start an editing task, Arc is smart enough to create a default feature template for that. Other times it just doesn't, and you have to create it manually, okay? You can't draw unless there's a feature template defined. And so the default feature template is nothing exciting at all. It'll just have the name of the layer, and it'll just have the default symbol for point, polyline, or polygon next to it. And when you highlight that, that is the layer that you're editing and that you want to create a feature for. Then down below are the different construction tools that are available to you to actually do that drawing. And so so what the feature templates provide behind this, if you actually go into a feature template property, is they let you specify symbology. So for example, I could have a field in my attribute table for that feature class that's called, let's see, we're looking at, in this example, roads. And so I could have a field called road type. And so what would be some road types I could have? You're right.
You don't have to keep changing the symbology.
So changing the symbology, what would I have to do normally if I ignored my feature templates? What would I have to do to get my different layers to show up with different, or same layer, but the different entities in that layer to show up with different symbols?
You have to manually go in and change them. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so I'd draw them first. I would draw all my roads. I might digitize them off a map. Then I'd have to go into my attribute table, and I'd have to go to that field called road type, and I'd have to change it. And I'd have to make sure that I spelled it correctly, right? Because if I had one that was gravel roads and then another one that was gravel road, then those would be two different types, right? But I'd have to go through and I have to manually change all those things. So I'm dealing with every single entity, every single thing that I want to draw twice. Whereas with a feature template, if you take a few seconds to think about what you want to display and show up in there, you can define those things, set the symbology, and then as you're drawing, all you do is you click on which one you want to draw. So in this case, local road or freeway or major highway, and then you click on whether it's the freehand tool or the line tool to actually draw it. And then it's already attributed correctly.
Is that like classification for the road, is that like added to the attribute table, or does it only apply for the symbology? Like what if you wanted to then go do some sort of analysis or something based on the different kinds of roads? Would that information still be in there?
That's a great question. So your question is, are the attributes, in this case of road type, and the symbology still saved with the layer afterwards, if I wanted to add that layer to another file? Is that right?
Yeah, sure. Or just like you wanted to do something organizing the roads besides just their symbology.
Right. So the way the feature templates work is you have to describe the, let's see, I've cut off the part, but you have to describe which field
Okay, so
it's modifying.
field.
So the answer to the data is that the data for that field is populated and is there so long as you hit save. And so if you add it somewhere else, that data is there. As far as the symbology goes, the symbology has nothing to do with the data file. So the symbology you could only save as a layer file, and then you could use that in another drawing, for example. Okay? So what it's doing in the current map document is two things. It's applying a symbology that you've defined, and it's then saving the data itself to the data file. Sort of convoluted, but once you understand what they are, they're actually very powerful. What most people do is have no idea what this box is all about because it's this new thing. And you just kind of click a few buttons until it works, and then you move on with life, and you do things the old way, which is basically editing everything twice, at least.
Did you say how to add it if it's missing? That happens all the time, and I never know how to figure it out.
Yeah, I did not. I mentioned that. Let me see if I have I should just open up. Let's do, of course, if I open it up, what'll happen is that it'll work perfectly this time, and I won't have to do that. But what you do is when you go into that right click on, let's see, where are we? Okay, so edit features. So you highlight the layer that you want, and you hit edit features. I think when it doesn't work, I can't remember if the start editing is grayed out or it lets you start edit, but then it just doesn't show up. What you have to do is define new types of features. The rhyme and reason on when it is that doesn't happen, I would love to know.
Can you also click that one button in the, when you're, where it should show the features when you're, if you go forward a couple slides? No.
Right here?
Yeah, I think, can you click that button up on the top right? Yeah, that button.
Oh yeah, you're right, because that's the open. It's the same command, right? It's to manage the feature templates. Yep, you're right. What you have to be a little bit careful of with that one is to make sure that you're highlighting the layer that you mean to be modifying, because it's easy for something else to be highlighted and you don't really realize it. But yeah, you're right, you can get in there. I can't remember for sure. I think that this managing feature templates may also let you switch between layers, but it's been a while. So good questions. There's a number of other editing toolbars. So it's not just the editor toolbar. There's other features that you can use to edit. And so for drawing, you'll want to probably shoot this little feature construction toolbar that comes up automatically. It follows you around. So as you're drawing, it puts this thing like just where you want to put the next vertice. So a little trick with this this little feature construction toolbar, if you drag it, so say like you're working along a road and you're digitizing it or something, you're drawing, you're going up, and the toolbar is right above you. If you drag it so it's below you, it'll stay below you. But then when you start coming around the other way, you might want to drag it again to get out of the way. So you can sort of put it out of your way. But what does the feature construction toolbar have on it? It has a snap to features. What is it that snapping does? It allows you to draw more precisely. It doesn't, yeah, so if I am, so let's say that there is an existing polygon and I want to draw a polygon that comes up right against it. So I just click with my mouse as best I can, and then I want this line to be shared. How do I click this exactly so that I'm exactly lining up here and then exactly lining up there versus being just a hair off? Yeah, so I can use snap to point, snap to vertex. There's different commands that I can use. And so those allow me to draw very accurately. You can also see that in this context menu, there's other things. I can specify the direction, the length. I can put in an absolute XY coordinate that I want to make the next vertice at. I can also specify it instead of by an absolute coordinate by what's called a delta XY. So and you're working around, maybe you're doing a polyline, maybe you're doing a polygon. Let's start with the easy one. What do I do to stop drawing a point? What? Just click. So that stops editing. When I draw the point, I'm done. So I don't have to stop drawing that particular point. When I want to stop editing, I can hit F2 to finish sketch. I can right click and hit end, or I can edit, stop editing. But to stop drawing a polyline or a polygon, what do I have to do? You could double click, you could hit F2, you can right click and hit finish sketch. So otherwise, and the double click will also work. The double click makes me a little nervous because if you're not fast enough on the double click, it adds another vertice. But whatever. You can delete the vertice. And so how do I do that? Right, so I have to get the select tool and select that feature, and then I can right click on it and bring up edit vertices, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. So Yeah, the back button is pretty handy. That is, oh, the undo. Yeah, the little back arrow undo right up here. Yeah, that's a handy one too. So play around with these different things. You'll get good at this this week. It's great fun. We've talked about snapping already and what that does. Has anybody used the autocomplete polygon tool? I don't expect you to be able to read this, but there's a link for if you download the slides to the help on this. Autocomplete polygon, what does that do? Yeah.
Like completes it for you, so like start to trace it and it'll have like the connector that ends up lining up.
So instead of, if I wanted to draw a polygon that butted up against this one here, instead of being really careful, I mean, what if this thing had a lot of vertices? I mean, I could use my snap modes, endpoint, 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 right? And it'd take me forever. Or I could do what you're describing and I just do something like this, and then it auto-completes it by forcing this edge to be a shared edge. It's basically enforcing a topology. We talked about topologies earlier. So that's pretty handy. Especially, so there are situations when you're doing with polygons where, I mean, so this is your classic, sort of Venn diagram garbage, right? So this is called a intersection. Exciting. These are called the union, right? And then I've got this thing which is totally separate from these things, right? It doesn't share a common edge and it doesn't have overlap. Instead, it has a gap. So autocomplete polygon is really useful if I want to have what's called a mutually exclusive classification, which means what? Have shared what? Shared areas. So if I'm drawing county boundaries or state boundaries or country boundaries, most countries don't like it when they have intersections of area, right? That can result in conflict. They like to share a common boundary, and you don't want gaps in between because who owns that, right? So a mutually exclusive classification would make sure that all those boundaries line up against each other. And there are lots of analysis examples where that matters. Okay. We mentioned, no, we didn't mention, no, we did. The edit sketch properties. Someone mentioned that if you want to draw more exactly, some of you you've already done this, I think, in the Geologic Map Lab for what? We made a polygon, and you were asked to draw it exactly. You were given some specific coordinates to use. So you actually used this edit sketch properties, and so that you could enter in, exact coordinates instead of rough coordinates and round those things appropriately. So this lets you set the X and Y coordinates. What if I want to have elevations? How do I do that? That's one way of doing it. What would you call the field? Elevation. Perfect. Elevation. And then I would go through and manually and tediously enter in an elevation with each one. That is a way to do it. Anybody know another way? So when you create a shapefile, there's a couple of checkboxes down at the bottom. Anybody have any recollection of what those say? Store Z values and store M values. Z values for elevation, M values for thickness. If you click on the Z value, what that does is it changes, in your attribute table, there's that shape column that doesn't really show you anything, but that's where all the shape information is. It changes it to a shape like ZM. And there's actually, instead of just the XY coordinates in there, there's an XYZ coordinate. And there are certain commands where having that elevation in as part of the explicit geometry of that shape is helpful. And so ARC doesn't make it overly easy on you if you want to do this. You have to, there are some instructions in a later lab, but you have to go down in and add a custom button that you drag up onto this toolbar that has this little set Z values. And then it'll allow you to set an elevation as you're drawing the point. So you can explicitly do that right when you're drawing the point instead of having to go back and manually edit it later. Okay. All right. So when it comes to editing existing features as opposed to drawing new features, there's a whole bunch of different things you can do. You can move, delete, separate, reshape, split, flip, scale, rotate, slipping. What is slipping? Trimming, simplifying, right? So there's all these crazy things that you can do to help you modify geometries to make them look like you want and make them fit for whatever purpose you're using them. So the best way to really understand these is trial and error. Go in and just screw around with them and see what they do. If it still isn't obvious to you, go read the help on most of these things. Most of them have a cartoon and they show you what it's talking about. But there's actually quite a few different commands for changing the geometry of these different features. Okay, querying. So when we're talking about querying in the context of editing, why would this be useful? First off, what's a query? A search. So if I want to search my data set for something, like give me an example of a search you guys might employ. Let's define a layer. Let's talk about the one that you're all staring at this week or last week, geology. So I've got polygons of rock types. What might I want to search for? It's the same rock type. What was the example? Yeah, certain rock type. So I want to know where all of the rock type, I can't even read what this says up here. It looks like CN. So unit symbol CN. So I can go into this, I can do a query in two places. I can query outside just to summarize data outside of an edit session. Or in an edit session, when I query, what does that result in? You're right, a new something, a new selection. And so I can select a subset of the whole data set there, a subset of features, and then those features are both highlighted on the map and in the attribute table. Okay, that's neat. Who cares? Why? Why is that useful in editing?
You can extract those things and create new layers.
You can extract it to, for example, another layer. What was your example?
Pretty much the same thing. You can create new layers based on certain
Yep.
criteria.
So because when you right-click to export data, one of the options is everything in the current layer, and the other options are everything in the current view, and then the other one is the selected. And so what else could I do in the context of editing? Yeah.
So I got a question. So if you wanted to highlight a certain rock type,
Yeah.
is this how you do it?
Yeah, so you would,
Highlight it and use that as your final map? something like that?
yeah, you could go into the attribute table and hit select by attributes, for example, in the pull-down menu up here. And then you would have to know which field has the attributes you're interested in. And then you create a little syntax, a little query here using the right syntax. So you would double click on the field, and then you would use the logic like equals this, or is greater than that, or whatever your logic is. And you can make these queries as complicated or as simple as you like. And then that will select everything. And so once I've selected them, I could delete them. Another thing I can do once I've selected is there's a command to invert the selection so that I could delete everything else, for example, or I could copy just those features to another layer. I could export them to another layer. I could highlight all the features, and then there's a little button down here which switches, there's two buttons that switch between showing me the whole list of features versus showing me just the things that are selected. So if I show just the things that are selected, and then I need to go through and I'm added a new field and it's for, I don't find this, this little abbreviation all that useful and I want to spell out the rock type, then I can actually go to just those ones that I've highlighted and then edit just those, for example. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why querying and editing helps you draw more efficiently and edit your data more efficiently.
So dissolving tool is the same as a query, right?
The dissolve tool is the same as a query?
Yeah.
No.
Because you're joining like polygons together, right?
Dissolve inside of an edit session or
Yeah.
I thought that what dissolve did, and I could be wrong on this, was take all of these, what are discrete features, and collapse them down into one feature that has the multiple entities. And so that there's,
Oh, so it's not the same thing, it's actually changing the
yeah,
entire,
versus a,
creating a new shapefile.
right, versus next week when we talk about spatial analyses, dissolve is a type of vector analyses that has very different meaning than a dissolve inside of a edit session. I could be
No, that
confusing
sounds
that
right.
with
I
one,
think that's
another
what
one.
it's doing, but, yeah. I
So,
just read dissolve.
yeah, I mean, what are you doing in your free time, right? Okay, hopefully not GIS. Digitizing. We talked about this the other day. See, that was the tablet that I was talking about, right? And so, see, you'd have this huge tablet and you would literally tape on your map or your aerial photo or whatever you wanted to do. And then you had this really cool mouse that had this little crosshair and you would go along and very accurately digitize. And you could just have hours and hours and hours of fun doing this. The digitizing process is just a fancy way of saying digitally tracing, right? And so I can digitize off of a digitizer tablet, or I can digitize inside of ArcMap if I have a scanned georeferenced image, for example. And so I get those scanned images with a little flatbed scanner that you all might have, or one of these nice fancy large format scanners that I can feed a map through. And basically this is, yeah, obviously not death to the girl, but death to the digitizer. You can kill her too if you want. But, so digitizing air is a natural artifact of doing this, because you can only digitize those vertices whether you're doing it digitally inside of a map or whether you're doing it off of a tablet. You can only do that so accurately, because where are your snap modes when we're digitizing off of a raster image or digitizing off of a hard copy tablet? Could I snap to an endpoint? It's sort of a trick question. There's actually algorithms that look for contrasts in the imagery and will allow you to snap to those things a little bit better. But in general, you're doing it manually. And so when you do that, you tend to get some sort of distribution. In this case, this is just an example of air in one component in the X direction. And in a perfect world, that distribution typically ends up as some sort of normally distributed distribution where it's roughly centered about 0 or a true value, and then you have some spread either way. If it's not centered around 0, then that means there's bias in your digitizing, which is just a fancy way of saying what? There's bias. You're off by a certain direction systematically. So you're systematically always lower. So you can see how this might happen, for example, on the digitizer tablet. You put your tape over your image that you put on your digitizer tablet, and then it sort of shifts down the table. And so you haven't recalibrated that digitizer tablet after the thing is shifted, and so you have this systematic offset in your data. And when you see that, what can you do with it? Well, if I know, if this is my distribution, that's a good one. Thanks. So this is error in some component. This is 0. This would be positive. This would be negative. And so instead of seeing something that looks like this, where I've got the points that are sort of around that, what I'm seeing is something that looks like this. What can I do with that? Shift it. How? So I can get that distance, and then I can apply that shift, for example, to my whole data set, if that's a systematic error. Now, the rest of these things are not systematic error. This is just digitizing error. Of course, when we talk about error, what's error? We're going to talk about this more on Thursday, much to your disappointment. A deviation from a correct point?
I just kind of wanted to clarify with this systematic error, so you literally just like add 1/10 of a degree or something to all of your coordinates?
Oh, or probably in Cartesian, so yeah, like a set distance in that one component. You could just add or subtract depending on which way it was going. If it was this way, would we add or subtract? Add to bring it back over, even though it's a negative bias. But in order to calculate errors in the first place, I need to know what truth is. And so how do I know what truth is? I have like a moment or something.
Take physical measurements. You have to actually take some measurements out in the field.
Okay, so one method is having some other physical measurements, some independent measurements to verify that. And there's no errors in those, right? So we actually very rarely ever calculate true errors because there's a relatively small number of circumstances where we can actually know truth. But what we often do is define a truth or something that's more true and then calculate errors based off of a comparison. And so, so some examples, I'll have more of this, but so like, let's say this vertice right here was supposed to end up, coming back to life, was supposed to end up here. And so the error, then I have an error in the horizontal or in the x direction and an error in the y direction. I may also have one in the z, but I'm not seeing it graphically here. And so I would then calculate that error based off of a comparison between what it should have been and what it was, for example. So there's different ways that you can sort of minimize, that's a neat way to spell source, that you can minimize errors in spelling, like spell check. There's also ways you can minimize your errors in digitizing using things like the snapping. CAD has way more snapping tools and a lot easier to draw more precisely in. So some people will actually draw in CAD and then import that data in. And then topology rules. If you impose a topology rule, then it won't let you continue unless the topology rules are met. So those are a few things that can help you.
So quickly,
Yeah.
digital elevation model,
Yeah,
it's approximating the actual terrain.
by interpolating
Yeah.
between observations.
So you're saying you actually need to start with a reference point or a single point that everything's referencing to, regardless if that's truth or not? And that's how you approximate?
There's a lot of nuances in how you could choose to go about estimating errors, not just in the horizontal, which we very loosely mentioned here, but also in the vertical. And we'll talk a little bit more about those when we talk about DEMs in a couple of weeks. You're now talking about 3 components.
Well,
And-
that's how I was thinking.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and we're going to cover it in more detail later. Yeah.
I don't expect you to fully answer this, but with topology, can you set it up before, or do you use it as like an after the fact to check what you've done?
You can set it up before so that it's enforced while you're doing editing. But a lot of the times, those are for specific vector data sets, not just points, lines, polygons, but say like a network is an example of something where you can define specific topology. And so a network is going to be a vector network of polygons, but it has to meet certain rules. So there are ways you can apply them also to points, lines, and polygons. We're not going to really touch on it in this class, but there's some good examples in some of the Esri tutorials on it. So it's one of these things like we were talking about geoprocessing and efficiency. Topology, like if you're going to be doing, say, your whole master's thesis is largely spent, or like 6 months of it is going to have to go through a whole bunch of historical photos and do basically a whole lot of tracing. That's a situation where you might want to go and look at some of these things because they could be huge time savers. For a lot of the things that we're going to do, these sort of quick and dirty analyses in this class, it's nice to know about, but it's not totally necessary. Okay. Good questions, guys. All right. We talked about attribute data at the very beginning, and we had the example of the fire hydrant, and the attributes were basically in our attribute table, the different rows or columns? Columns. And we call columns in an attribute table fields. And then the rows are, again, what? Different what? Vectors, yeah?
Records.
Oh, different records, yeah. So in database world, there are different records. They're different entities of this feature class. Different features is another way of describing those. So the key step you have to take to add attributes, I think you mentioned it earlier, is you have to add a field. You have to add another column. And so when can I add another column? How can I add another column?
You have to go start editing, right? You have to edit the actual,
You have to not be editing.
not be editing.
That's the nuance. So it's really annoying because a lot of the times it's when you're editing that you think, you know what, I really need another field here. I need another category. That would be really useful. And you can't add it then because there's a lock on it. You have to stop editing and then go back out. And you can add a field in the table by going to this table and then bringing this down. There's a thing called add field. You can bring a field in. And like we discussed in the very early days, we have to specify the type, which is whether it's a point, polyline, or polygon. We have to specify then no, I'm lying to you. That's not it. That's if we're specifying a feature class. What do we have to specify for a field? Text or number, and then the scale and the precision of that if it is a number. If it's text, it's just the length. So what if I want to, is there another way I can add a field? Arc catalog? Okay. So if I go into Arc catalog and I have an existing data set, actually back up. I go into Arc catalog and I make a new feature class. When I make that new feature class, I can add a bunch of fields then, right? If I go into Arc catalog and I want to add a field to an existing feature class, what do I have to do? I right-click on it and hit Add Field, and then it won't let me. Why? What? I'm out of my edit session, but I've got ArcMap open. The file's locked by ArcGIS. The file is in ArcMap in the table of contents, not being edited, and then the table of contents isn't smart enough to let you edit it. So if you want to add a field in the Arc catalog, thank you, then you have to make sure that it's not also in your active ArcMap document.
What if you change it to theme?
Same rules apply, I believe. Yeah. Same. convoluted rules. These are all those horrible rules. Okay. And then if I want to edit values inside here, I can go into the attribute table and edit those values in an edit session, only in an edit session. So once that, that layer is being edited, I can go in and I can change things. So I can do it in here, and then I can also do it in what's called the attributes window. Has anybody used this? So the attributes window is a window that you can have popped up, and basically as you're going through and editing and selecting different entities, it's showing you all of the fields for that particular entity, and you can edit them all right there. So the feature class templates are nice for populating a single field, but if you want to populate multiple fields at once before you're done with drawing that entity, the attribute window is really helpful for that. Okay. Summarize. Has anybody ever played with this? Yeah? What does it do? What it says? It summarizes.
Like I've used it where you have like a bunch of points
Yeah.
that you calculated, like for the length of a network of streams.
Yep.
And then you want to add it all together so that you have the length of all the streams.
Total
in
length.
shape.
Or the average length, or whatever you want. Yeah, so you basically go in, you select the field that you want to summarize. So in your case, instead of area, it would have been length of stream. And then you can then calculate summary statistics based off of that and dump them in an output table. Okay, so those can be pretty handy ways of summarizing everything in one field across your multiple attributes. I'm sorry, not multiple attributes, across your multiple features, rather. Calculate geometry. Have we had you guys do this yet? Yeah? Okay. So calculating geometry is basically I might add a new field. That field could be x coordinate, y coordinate. You mentioned elevation. Or it could be, if it's polygons, areas or perimeter or whatever. If it's streams, it could be stream length. And so I could easily make that field, and then I have to tell it which property I want to calculate, what coordinate system I want to do that in, because the answers can be different, and what units I want to use. And so, for example, with streams, you may decide that you want to calculate stream length in both meters and kilometers. And so you might have two different columns for those two different measures. Okay, so that's a really handy little tool. Where do I get to that? Attribute table as well. So everything's from that context menu in that attribute table. Let's see. And so that's calculate geometry. And then there's field calculator. And so field calculator lets you come up with some sort of syntax for combining different attributes. So how did you guys get in your geologic map the legend to look like you wanted in terms of the label? The label for the legend of the rock types. What?
Symbology and the properties.
Symbology and the properties, and then, so how many different rock types did you have? Ish? 5? 500? Yeah. Okay, and then how many did you show in your legend?
A lot less.
A lot less? I don't know, like 40, 50? So if I understand you, what you did, so you had a field that might have been like CB, and then there was what that rock type was, then it spelled out that whole rock type, right? Whatever that rock type was. And what we wanted was a label that had both the abbreviation, which showed up on the map, and the whole description. So you went through and edited manually every single, all 40 or 50?
Oh, I thought you were talking how I selected those that were going to be put in the legend.
Uh-huh.
And how to narrow that down, and that was done in the symbology using the count.
Okay. So, no, but in terms of actually getting that label. You combine those fields. So did you use the field calculator to do that? Or did you just manually? Field calculator. Did I show you how to do that? Oh, never mind. No wonder you're all looking at me like,
I have a
question.
about, why can't you copy and paste in and out of attribute tables? Will that ever be something that
You can copy within.
but I mean, like, I've always wanted to go like from Excel,
Oh,
something like into an attribute table or from the attribute table into Excel without having to use like some other tool that's like export my table.
because ARC thinks it's too easy to screw up. And because a table is treated very differently in ARC than geometry. So when you add a table to ARC, it gets added, but then when you want to display it, you have to display X, Y, and choose the columns. And if you weren't doing that display thing, if you just wanted to bring things in, there would be no geometry explicitly associated necessarily with that. It doesn't know that you're always going to bring in an X and a Y. So it doesn't allow you to do that. It's really annoying, but it's because the geometry is not implicit, or I'm sorry, explicit.
So when you're saying you add data, you can add an Excel file,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to clearly define what's your X and Y.
Well, you can you can add a table to your table of contents, but you can't display that until you display as XY, display table as based on XY that you specify those two columns for. When you do that, it's simply displaying it. It's not until you export that to a feature class or a shapefile that it then becomes a fully functioning feature class or shapefile that has all that geometry associated with it. Part of it has to do with being able to facilitate things like reprojecting on the fly because you have a coordinate system associated with it. So another way of editing data, rather, or creating data, collecting data, is to use something like ArcPad. How many of you have used ArcPad? Did you guys use it in 1800 or no, just on your own? So ArcPad allows you to go out and you can use ArcPad in the field where you don't actually have a GPS. You can just have layers loaded and you simply draw. You could use ArcPad in the office to do that too. It's just a skimped down Arc map essentially. But the other thing that it has the ability to talk to a GPS card on, say, a little handheld unit. And that GPS card will then pass the location information that you'll use for your vertices. And so you can be moving along, and so in this case it looks like they're kind of marching out and drawing the boundaries maybe of something along this parking lot here. And so if I'm going to go ahead and do that, all I do is I start this feature, and then I go along, and at every vertex I click a button, and it's just grabbing the GPS coordinate. So that's real easy. What happens, though, when I don't have a GPS signal? Yeah, flashes a question mark at you, and then you can manually enter in a coordinate or manually draw on the screen to approximate that, or you wait until you can get a GPS signal again. So lets you go in between. The other thing you can do is you can build in air checking in the field. So you can make what are called quick forms in ArcPad. And quick forms allow you to specify all the attribute fields that you want. And then you can actually build in a little user interface, and you make the little user interface, and it's real easy to do this, and you control what can be entered in it. So when you make an attribute field that's of type, say, text box, can they just enter anything they want in as long as it's less than the total length of that text box? Or are you going to turn that text box into a pull-down list and they can only select certain choices? So for example, with fire hydrants, I might get somebody describing it as red with a capital R, somebody else with a lowercase r, somebody else who's going to call it crimson or something, right? And so I could limit the choices that they have to make there with these quick forms. And so if you have ArcPad, you can do this really easily. You guys don't have ArcPad with the education license that we've given you. If you're in a lab that buys legitimate ArcGIS licenses from software services, from IT, you can get a copy of ArcPad for free if you've paid for the other stuff. So we do have the licenses for it on campus. And you can make, the little user interface that you make is pretty simple with just these default tools, but very quick and dirty and easy to make. And you can build in error checking. But then you can use ArcPad Studio to make much fancier applications that have a whole lot more custom features. So for example, here's date visited. Instead of requiring your user to type in the date for every single thing, it can just grab that date from the computer itself. You could do the same thing. Here's an example that they're using for a geology field camp for doing some basic geologic mapping. And so there's a whole bunch of custom things for recording structural notes, collecting particular samples, recording a photo, et cetera, et cetera. And so each of these buttons brings up a different dialogue for asking the user to enter in the appropriate information on that. So let's see, this is just boring links. So what I wanted to point out with attributes is that if you can, at the data collection stage may be either your desk or it may be in the field. And so the data collection stage, you can build in through forms and controls ways to force the user to put the information in the way that you want it, so you can do analyses on it, instead of having to fix it after the fact. With attribute data that comes from ArcPad, you just make one of those forms. What do you do when you're digitizing? You use a feature template. That's one way you can force the user to enter in the correct stuff. Okay, metadata. So if you're sleeping now, you're really going to sleep on this. Metadata is just the what, the how, the who, the where. This is the thing that you all want to know about the data set you downloaded off of some Google search, but that most people are too lazy to ever fill out. And so don't be so modest as to think that the data that you're working on, the data that you're creating, is never going to be useful to anybody else. There's probably going to be some poor sucker after you who has to go and make sense of whatever mess you made, and metadata can really help them out. And so pay it forward, and hopefully if you do it, other people will do that for you too. Where do you get the metadata? One of the confusing things about finding metadata in Arc is that they don't call it metadata where you access it. What they call it is item description, which I guess is logical, but it's not called metadata. So when you go to item description, that's where it is. You can get to an item description in Arc Catalog, or you can get to item description in your table of contents. You can go and you can view that item description. There's also metadata associated with the map document. And so if you go to the map document properties, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. The file name, the title, the summary, a description, author, credits. Have any of you ever filled out anything on this form, or do you always just only click store relative path names? I already know the answer. You haven't ever looked at this. So this is, if you're sharing map documents, this is maybe useful. If you're creating such a huge plethora of map documents that you're going to confuse yourself and you can't remember what the hell you did, filling out some of this for your own selfish purposes can be quite useful to go back for. But when we're talking about metadata associated with data sets, so a raster file or a shape file or a feature class in a file geodatabase, you can have metadata associated with each of those. And inside of a geodatabase, it could be you have metadata for the geodatabase itself and then for all the individual layers in it. So you can have these different levels of metadata. And when you go to that item description, what does it look like? It looks something like this, depending on how you view it. There are basically different metadata fields, you can think of them as, that are populated and then displayed in different ways. So here I've got summary. And credits is really useful. If you're going to, a bunch of you have asked, how do I cite appropriately a data source? If you're creating data that other people might use, fill out this credits things, because it gives people a way to correctly cite your data if they're using it. And that's a good place to check. A lot of people never fill this in. There's also, in ArcMap options, you can make your metadata show more. There's different metadata styles. And so metadata all gets stored typically in an XML format. So XML is this extendable markup language, right? We looked at some XML files earlier. And so there's all these different fields in there. Only some of them are populated. But then there's a whole bunch of different ways to organize and display that according to different standards that various organizations use. And so you can change the default in ArcMap options for how metadata is stored. And then inside of that, you've got all of these different categories which are inside that XML. And so here I've got citation, keywords, abstract, purpose, dataset languages, resource constraints, limitations of use, spatial representation type. So it's a vector. Where was this stuff made? It was made on Microsoft Windows Server using ArcGIS 10 as opposed to ArcGIS 3. And then you've got all the stuff like bounding polygon and what is the coordinate system that was used here? What's the datum? Are there different transformations in this? On and on and on this boring list goes. But if you're trying to figure out whether or not the data that you've downloaded is what you want, or if it was calculated in the right way, derived in the right way, collected in the right way, etc., some of this metadata can really save you. So you can browse around in there. If you want to create metadata, you end up usually doing it in Arc Catalog. And you go to a layer, and you right-click on it, and you hit edit that item description or edit the metadata, and then you go in and you basically have a bunch of fields that you can fill out for all of these different categories. Some things are auto-populated, like if you have a projection associated with it, it auto-populates those fields. Question?
Is the metadata just the description, or does it include the actual data itself?
It's just the description of that data.
Okay.
Yep.
And is there any way to view that before you download something?
Yeah, a lot of places will let you view the metadata separately. And so in a lot of cases, the metadata is an XML document. And so they'll just pass that to the browser and let you view it. You can manually look at XML in any web browser or in any text editor. And so if you download something and you know what you're doing and you know which XML file it is, you can look at those as well. Good question. And what you'll find here is, you can get really carried away. You could spend, 5 minutes making your data and 5 hours filling out the metadata for it. Some metadata is good. It's got to be fit for purpose. Is this something that's a reminder to you so that you can figure this out later, or to help the next poor soul that, may come fill your shoes after you leave? Or is this something where, no, I'm going to put this out and anybody in the world can grab this stuff and use it, in which case you might want to provide a little bit more robust metadata. Okay, so how far do you go is basically some common sense questions that we just raised. So who's the audience? We talked about what's the purpose of the data and therefore the metadata. When you're sharing a paper map or PDF, what's the value of metadata? Because I've got different layers there. So what sort of metadata should I have with a static map? Depends on the purpose. It depends on how much information you need to provide to that person for them to judge whether or not your paper map is fulfilling its purpose. So you can get a feel for this from, say, the USGS with the 7.5-minute quad and the information it puts around the sides of those maps to tell you how that data came about. And then how to cite, metadata can give the answer to that. The 6 C's in metadata. Colorful really doesn't matter, right? It's just metadata. Creative probably doesn't really matter, but correct, context, convincing, and consistent, those things are all really important. If you've created a whole bunch of shape files that are the same sorts of things, but say for different areas, so let's say that you're collecting, I don't know, information on where you see elk or something, and you have these different elk shape files for several different management areas. It'd make a lot of sense to make sure that you're consistent in the metadata for all of those different shape files so that when a user's looking at them, it's really logical. So I preach about this metadata. I'm guilty, as the rest of you, about being inconsistent on filling it out. We're going to force you this week in Lab 4 to share your data in a whole bunch of different formats for different reasons with different people, and you're going to have to come up with why would this format be more useful to someone than this format. And we're going to be looking to see if you've actually, even though we don't emphasize it that much, to see whether or not you've actually provided or filled out any metadata with that. So I'm going to skip this. I was going to have you guys make a little application, but it's not really that important. This will be the last lab for those of you in WATS 6915, and then for the rest of you, this will just be yet another step along the tortuous path to the end of this class. So, any questions? Get out of here.